Hi folks, HR Funk here. A couple of weeks ago, I produced a review video on a Discoveryopt rifle scope. And if you saw that video, you know that I was pretty favorably impressed with that optic. And as I always do when a manufacturer sends me a product to review, I sent a link to the video back to Discoveryopt, and they were apparently pretty happy with the video because they asked me if I wanted to test another one of their scopes. This time around, a 1 to 8x low power variable optic, aka an LPVO, and I said, sure, that sounds great. So a few days later, this scope arrived. This is their 1 to 8 power SFIR, and in this video we're going to take a close-up look at this scope. We'll head off to the range and do some testing with it, and at the end I'll tell you what I think of it. Now, something I want to mention is this is probably going to be a long video. I've already recorded a significant portion of it, and I've got more information I'm going to be adding right now. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this optic specifically or one similar to it, watch the entire video because there's probably going to be some information that I cover that's going to be beneficial to you in your purchase. So with that out of the way, let's get right to the close-up shop review of this 1 to 8 power SFIR from Discoveryopt. And here we go with the up-close look at the Discoveryopt scope. And once again, this is the Discoveryopt ED-AR 1 to 8 by 24 SFIR scope. And when we open the box, a little bit of dramatic pause there while I get the box open. We find, once again, the checklist that comes from Discoveryopt. I noted this the last time I reviewed one of their scopes, and they check off all of these various characteristics of the scope just to show that they were in fact checked before the scope left the factory, and I had that one upside down. There is an instruction manual, and I'll be interested to look through this manual. The last time around, one of my criticisms of the optic was the manual was not nearly as detailed as I thought it needed to be for a scope as complex as the one I was reviewing. There is also a lens cloth. Here we have the scope itself waiting to be removed from the plastic. There's a kill flash for all of you who are worried about some reflection off the scope's objective lens giving away your position. And a sunshade. Up, and I missed something else down in there. There is also this card that shows you all the specifications for the scope. Now, I think that's everything from down inside the box. And I did miss one other thing down inside the box. There is this tool for resetting the turret caps to 0. This came with the last scope that I reviewed from Discoveryopt, and it's kind of a handy little thing to have around, except of course when I went to the range with that scope, I forgot to take this with me, so I'll try to make sure I take it along this time. Something else I want to show you this time around before I actually mount the scope is the mount that came along from Discoveryopt. These are available on the Discoveryopt website. The price is very reasonable. And the thing that I noticed the last time with the included rings from Discoveryopt was that they are extremely high quality, and this mount appears to be exactly the same. Even the way they package it. It's in a very nice box. The screws are secured back here so they're not rolling around inside there, or they're not in a little plastic bag or whatever. There is a wrench to assist with mounting the scope. And when I pull this out, you can see the polished interior of the rings that are attached to this mount. It has the torque specifications for the cap screws as well as the cross screws for mounting this to the rail on your rifle. So I am very impressed with the machining and the quality of the rings and the mounts that come from Discoveryopt. You could spend a lot more money and not get nearly as good a mount or rings as you do from Discoveryopt for a very reasonable price. And here's our first close-up look at the Discoveryopt 1 to 8 by 24 ED-AR SFIR scope. And I found something in the box that I didn't notice when I was taking everything else out. There was a lot of stuff in there, folks. And that is the throw lever right here that I have now attached to the magnification power ring, so it is working properly, and I just wanted to point out that it was also included. I think before I go on with this review, I want to decipher some of the nomenclature associated with this scope. Now, as you heard me say when I was describing this from the box, this is the ED-AR. ED stands for extra low dispersion glass, which is used on the lenses of this scope to improve image quality and light transmission. AR pretty much goes without saying. It's intended for use on AR style rifles. 1 to 8 is the magnification range. It goes from 1 power, which is no magnification. The image looks the same as it does through your unaided eye, all the way up to 8 power, which means the image appears to be 8 times larger than it does with your unaided eye. 24 is the diameter of the objective lens. I'll show you that in a little bit, as measured in millimeters. SFIR actually stands for two different things. The SF stands for side focus, and this scope has a side-mounted parallax focus adjustment that you can see here. The IR stands for illuminated reticle, so it does have illumination for the reticle, and that is controlled by the outboard knob right here on this adjustment turret. And I'll talk about all these things in detail as I work my way through this review. Turning our attention to the tail of the tape, this scope is 11.4 inches in overall length. It has a tube diameter of 34 millimeters. The objective lens, as I said earlier, measures 24 millimeters in diameter, and the weight of this scope is just a little over 24.2 ounces. Normally, when I review a rifle scope, I go through all the technical specifications like exit pupil and eye relief and one thing and another. But since Discoveryopt conveniently includes that card in the box with the scope that has all that data printed on it, what I'm going to do instead is flash that up on the screen, and you can pause the video if you want to and take note of anything that is of particular importance to you, and obviously you can disregard anything that you're not interested in. Here's a look at the scope's ocular lens, and it does have a fast focus eyepiece to allow you to bring the reticle into sharp focus for your vision. And on the website for this scope, it indicates that the fast focus eyepiece is locking or lockable, and I cannot figure out how to lock it. And one of my complaints with this optic, and I mentioned this the last time I reviewed a Discoveryopt scope, is that the instructions are not very detailed for an optic that is as complex as this one is. If I could make a suggestion to Discoveryopt, it would be to completely rewrite the instructions for their optics to make them much, much more comprehensive and detailed, to include all of the features and how to adjust them, like how to lock and or unlock the fast focus eyepiece. The magnification adjustment ring is found in its normal location, just forward of the ocular lens. And I already showed you the throw lever that's included with this, which makes it very easy to turn. And the magnification ring, even without using the throw lever, turns pretty easily. So I like that. It has texturing on there, so if you're not using the throw lever, you still have plenty of grasping surface. This is a 1 to 8 power optic, and it's a first focal plane optic, meaning that the reticle gets larger and smaller as the magnification increases and decreases. That way, the reticle, which is mil-based, is always true regardless of the magnification setting. Here's a close-up look at the left side adjustment turret for this scope. As I said earlier in the video, the outboard knob is the illumination control for the reticle, and there are 6 brightness settings. In between each one of the brightness settings, there is an off position, so you can simply put this in an off position right next to the brightness setting that you want, and you only have to turn it one click in order to get that brightness level. Now, one of the things I notice while turning this is it's pretty stiff. It's turnable, definitely, but you have to put some effort into grasping that and turning the knob. The outer circumference of this knob is textured to make it a little easier to get a hold of, but it still takes a little bit of work to turn that thing. Now this is a brand new scope, so that could break in after a while and get easier and easier to turn, but I'm not too worried about it being accidentally bumped and changing my illumination setting. The very outside of this knob also is the cover for the battery housing that provides the power for the illuminated reticle, and this uses a standard CR 2032 battery, which was not included with the scope. And I don't know if that was just an oversight on the part of the person who packaged this scope, or if they just don't ship these with a battery. Fortunately, I have a bunch of those 2032 batteries and I put one in there, so it was not a real big deal. But I just thought it was odd because virtually every optic that I've received that uses some sort of illumination has a battery included, and this one did not. The inboard portion of this turret, as I mentioned before, is the side focus for the parallax adjustment, and this can be turned all the way down to focus at 5 yards. So I think that's tremendous, especially when you're doing your preliminary zero of this optic, and maybe it's the first time you've shot it, so you have the target very close and you want to dial that down so you can get good sharp focus on your target. And then all the way up 10 yards, 15, 25, it goes up then to 100, 200, 500, and then infinity. This is something on a scope like this that I have wanted for a long time, because when we get out to greater distances, the ability to focus on the target, even without an adjustment like this, isn't that bad. It's much more forgiving at greater distances to be able to see your target clearly through your optic, but at the closer distances, when you're using an optic like this and you're getting into the 25-yard range or the 50-yard range or something like that, not being able to dial this down and focus your image properly can be kind of unsettling when you're trying to shoot and you can't get that good clear image, especially once again when you're trying to do something very precise or you're zeroing or what have you. So I am very happy to see the side focus. I think that's going to be a tremendous addition for this optic. Here's a close-up look at the windage and elevation adjustment turrets. Both of these have clicks that are graduated in 1/10 of a milliradian. Both of them, for one complete revolution, will move the point of impact 6 mils. The elevation adjustment turret has a total adjustment range of 38 mils. The windage adjustment turret has a total adjustment range of 22 mils. Both of these turrets have a textured surface around the circumference, just like the other controls that I talked about earlier, to make them easier to grasp and move. And something that I really like about these is they are locking turrets. Right now, both turrets are pushed in or pushed down and in, respectively. In order to use the turret, you first have to pull it up, then you can turn it normally. The clicks are tactile. I can feel them. They are not very audible. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear those. I'll stop talking while I turn these. You can see if you can hear them over the microphone. Seemed like I could hear them a little bit more as I was turning them there, but when I push them back down, they are locked in place. Now, if you've seen some of my other recent scope reviews, you know that I've been talking quite a bit about the attachment method used by different manufacturers for their adjustment turrets. And my primary complaint has to do when you are re-indexing the turret to 0. Some of them use attachment methods that are tedious, and it's very difficult to re-index the turret, hold it in place, and tighten down little screws and various other things without inadvertently changing the adjustment of your turret. In fact, that kind of drives me up the wall. Since these are locking turrets, when they are locked in place, I can use that tool that I showed you from the box a while ago, and I can unscrew the big screws that secure the turrets in place, but since they're locked, it's not going to change the setting of that turret. Then I can simply turn the turret back so the 0 marking lines up with the indicator on the scope body, put it in place, tighten the big screw back down, and everything's ready to go. Since it's locked the entire time, I don't have to worry about changing that setting, and I really, really like that feature of this scope. There's a view of the 24mm objective lens, and this is probably a good time to tell you that these scopes are shockproof, waterproof, and they are nitrogen purged. This scope uses a mill-based Christmas tree style reticle, and I'm going to flash a diagram up on the screen so you can see what it looks like. I'm not going to try to get a shot through the scope. I might try to do that when we're out at the range, depending upon light conditions. Sometimes I can get a so-so image, but the image always looks better when you're looking through the optic with your eye than it does when I'm trying to take a photograph with my camera. In any case, again, something that I mentioned earlier in the video comes back to haunt us at this point, and that is the fact that the instructions that accompany this scope don't have any real detailed information or even a really good detailed drawing for the reticle listing all the dimensions of all the various articles you can see in the reticle. A lot of them you can decipher by looking at this, and you can measure them, and if you understand the milliradian system and you know how to measure with that, you can sort of tell what size everything is and how to use it. But I would prefer to have a very detailed diagram that has all those measurements to take any guesswork out of it. Even so, this should be perfectly usable for holds at different distances and wind holds and moving target leads and range estimation, etc. And since this is a first focal plane optic, the reticle is always calibrated properly regardless of the magnification setting, so magnification is not going to have any effect on any of those operations I mentioned a moment ago. Turning our attention to the illumination for this scope, the only part of the reticle that's illuminated are the horseshoe and the very center dot that you see in the diagram. So the entire Christmas tree does not light up. When I get out to the range, I'll take a look at the illumination under daylight conditions. Now, as I've said recently, I don't use illumination in my scopes under bright daylight conditions except for very certain circumstances. But I know some of you do, so I'll take a look at that when we get out there to see if it's going to be usable for you. The Discoveryopt ED-AR 1:8x24 SFIR has a lifetime warranty for the original purchaser. If there is a defect discovered in material or workmanship, Discoveryopt will repair or replace this scope so long as you follow the procedure listed in their manual. This scope sells on the Discoveryopt website for just under $200. In fact, the MSRP is $199.83. And as you can see, I'm now out on the range with the Discoveryopt ED-AR 1:8x24 SFIR first focal plane scope. And yes, that's a mouthful. I just finished zeroing the scope. Zeroing was no problem. It was all pretty straightforward. It took me maybe half a dozen shots to get a zero on the scope for this distance of 100 yards where I'm set up. Also, I re-indexed the turret caps to the 0 setting, and that was just as easy as I thought it was going to be back in the shop. Every manufacturer should use this type of an attachment method for their turret caps because it makes it very quick, very positive, and there's not that tedious trying to keep from changing the setting and trying to make sure you get the index mark lined up absolutely properly. I really liked that. I also, just as I said back in the shop, checked the illumination for daylight brightness, and this is mid-November here in Ohio, so it doesn't get quite as bright this time of the year as it does in the middle of the summer. And it's just after noon here, but I'm having no problem seeing the illuminated reticle when I look through the scope, and I don't even have to turn it up on the highest brightness setting. Somewhere around brightness setting 3 or so, it's easy to see. I can actually see the reticle on the lowest setting, on setting number 1, but it's just kind of dim. And by the time I turn it all the way up to number 5, it's actually brighter than it needs to be, even out here in the middle of the day. So for those of you that like to use illumination, even on a bright sunny day, the illumination is going to be bright enough in this optic. I checked this on my calibrated target that's down on the target board, and I tried to get some images through the scope with my camera, and it is just not happening. But I can tell you that the elements in the scope line up properly with the calibrated target, so there should be no issues using the reticle for any of the functions it's designed to do. I also have noticed as I'm looking through here
that the glass is not quite as sharp and clear as some other scopes that I've used. Now I have to keep reminding myself this is a $200 scope. But it's just something I notice. It just seems to be not quite, the colors are not quite as sharp, not quite as crisp, and the image just doesn't seem to be quite as bright as other LPVO type scopes that I've used. Also, when I use the fast focus eyepiece to focus the reticle, it seems like I can just never get it perfectly focused. It always seems like it's off a little bit, and I was fiddling for quite a while trying to get it dialed in just right. So I noticed that too. Now, for a scope that costs $200, if it puts accurate shots on target, holds zero, and allows you to use your rifle under conditions like this, that's probably pretty good. Again, for a $200 optic. If this was a $2,000 optic, then my expectations would be much, much different. In any case, I'm going to start shooting here in a couple of minutes. I'm going to test a couple of things. I'm going to shoot a box test first. Now, if you've not seen that before, I have a target down on the target board. By the way, this target was provided, or printed, I should say, by Targets Online, but provided to me by Target Eagle. You might have seen that video a while back with the phone app that you can use in conjunction with the targets. And I like this target because it's got 5 bullseyes on it that are farther apart than the target that I normally use for a box test, so it allows for a little bit greater range of motion with the turrets. What I'm going to be doing in the box test is trying to see if the scope tracks properly for the number of clicks that I change the elevation and windage setting throughout the course of the test. So the 5 bullseyes on the target are basically arranged in a square with the center bullseye in the center. Every shot that I fire is going to be at that center bullseye, but I'm going to be changing the elevation and windage settings, and if the scope tracks properly, I should end up with shot number 2 in the top right bullseye, shot number 3 in the top left bullseye, shot number 4 in the bottom left bullseye, shot number 5 in the bottom right bullseye, and the last shot should be right back dead center in the middle. And again, that's where I'm aiming every single time. So my point of aim doesn't change, only the setting on the scope. As I said, if the scope tracks properly, the last shot should be right there with the first. Now, the last time I tested a Discoveryopt scope, the final bullet basically went through the same exact hole as the first bullet. So I was pretty impressed by that. We'll have to see if this one continues in that same tradition. So I'm going to get things set up here and get ready to go. By the way, my ammunition for this test is 77 grain match ammo from House of Pain. Thanks to you folks at House of Pain for sponsoring the ammo for this test. So here we go with the box test, folks. Remember, each one of these shots that I'm about to fire is going to be aimed at the center bullseye, but I'm going to be changing the elevation and windage setting for each shot. First shot's away. Now I'm going to come up 2.6 mils. And I'm going to go right 1.6. And we're ready for shot number 2. Shot number 2 is downrange. Now I'm going to go left 3.2 mils. And we're ready for shot number 3. Shot number 3 is away. Now I'm going to come down 5.3 mils. There's down 5.3, aiming once again at the center bullseye. Now I'm going to come right 32 clicks, which is 3.2 mils. And we're ready for the next shot. Now I'm going to come up 2.6 mils. And I seem to be off by 1 click, and I suspect that I accidentally went 2 clicks, or actually 0.2 of a mil, but only felt 1 click. The clicks are a little mushy, so it's easy to accidentally overshoot one. I also need to come left 1.6 mils. And I did the same thing on the windage knob. I was off by 1 just because I get an occasional mushy click as I'm going. So the last time I tested a Discoveryopt scope, the final shot was basically through the same hole as the first shot. Let's see what happens this time around. All right, I can't really see them through the Discoveryopt scope. With the 8 power under my lighting conditions out here today, I just can't see those shot holes, but I'll look through the spotting scope and see what I can see. And things are looking pretty good. Let's head down range and take a closer look at the target. Not bad, folks. I think this was shot number 1, just from looking back on the video. And we came up and to the right and hit here. And if you look at where these shots are in relation to each other, not so much where they are in the bullseye, look at this. We've got this shot right here, and I could take a ruler and draw a straight line almost to this shot. And then straight down to this one. They're both favoring the right. Actually, all of these shots are favoring the right a little bit. So I might need to recalculate my sight correction on these to bring it to the center of these a little bit more. But as far as their relationship to each other, that's pretty much perfect. I'm still off just a little bit to the right here, and I'm not really too worried about that. For this type of an optic, you're not going to be doing a lot of this clicking anyway, and I think that's a pretty good box test for a $200 scope. All right, folks, confession time. The box test you just saw was actually the second one that I shot with this scope. When I fired it the first time, first off, I forgot to activate the camera that was pointed at me, so I didn't have that footage. But also, after the very first shot went basically right dead center through the red part of that center bullseye. And after that, I started hitting low, as in about a mil low, probably 3.6 inches low on every one of those bullseyes. And the last shot that I fired, shot number 6, was about a mil low. And it wasn't until I came back here and looked through the scope that I realized what I had done. When you look at that Discoveryopt reticle, I'm going to put a diagram back up so you can see it. There is an aiming point above the center of the crosshairs. You'll see that floating around up there. And what I did inadvertently was started aiming with that aiming point. And I was not even conscious that I was doing it. I think that's kind of confusing being there. I'm not sure what its purpose is. But that's something I would recommend to Discoveryopt, is just delete that top aiming point, dot, whatever you want to call it, because when someone's shooting, especially if they were shooting under stress in a match or something else, that's very easy to all of a sudden start to focus in on that thing. As I said, I did it without even realizing I was doing it. So I would strongly recommend that be deleted from the reticle. Next, I'm going to test to see if the Discoveryopt scope holds its 0 as I change from one magnification level to another. I'm going to fire 4 shots. I'm going to start out on 1 power. Then I'll go to 4 power, 6 power, and 8 power. And we're going to be firing once again at the bullseye target down there. I'm on 1 power now. And on 1 power, with no magnification whatsoever, again, I'm trying to get a good sharp focus on that reticle. And I think I'm going to add a little bit of illumination just to make things easier to see. And we'll try the first shot. With that shot, what I did was basically held the horseshoe around the target that I'm shooting at, and I tried to hold it as well as I could and fired that shot. Truthfully, as long as that's somewhere in the bullseye, I'm going to be pretty happy. And I think I'm seeing it at 2 o'clock on the line of the X-ring. If so, I'm pretty happy with that. So let's go up to 4 power. This should be a little easier this time. And now the illumination really is not helpful because I've got that red bullseye and I've got the red dot in the center of the scope, and they're sort of blurring together, so I can't tell one from the other. Yeah, the black is much better this time around. All right. Definitely see that one at the bottom of the X-ring. So things are looking pretty good on the lower magnification settings. Let's go to 6 power and see what happens. And here again, I have to refocus that reticle. Another one staying right there with the rest of the group. Last shot on 8 power. Final shots downrange. And it looks like I pulled that last shot a little bit to the right. Not bad though. Let's go down and take a look at the group. So there we go. 4 shots at 4 different magnification settings, all in less than 1 inch. That's just over 3/4 of an inch. So that's a, if I can get everything lined up here, that's a sub MOA group from that Discoveryopt scope. As I said, firing at varying magnification levels, and I don't see any zero shift whatsoever. So what do we think of the Discoveryopt scope when we dial it down to 1 power and use it as a close range optic? Again, the image quality is just not quite as sharp as I would like it to be, and I still cannot get a really good focus on this reticle. And I've not had that problem before. That's better. So that's one thing about this scope that I definitely want to talk to the folks from Discoveryopt about. There's something going on, and maybe it's just this one. Maybe this is just one that made it out and doesn't quite have the right adjustment to the optics or whatever. But let's try a few close-in shots just to see how it does. Now looking at these shots, I'd say my bad guy is going to have a pretty rough time. Good shot there. This one's a little high, but I still don't think he's going to realize it was a little bit high. So the Discoveryopt 1:8 SFIR is definitely usable, but don't, at least based on this one, don't expect $2,000, $3,000 scope performance out of this $200 optic. All right, folks, moment of truth. Is the Discoveryopt SFIR a tack driver? I've got the magazine loaded, I've got a tack in the target, so let's find out. Oh, I have to hold over at this distance, and I just estimate the holdover. That was a pretty close estimate, but just not quite enough. Let's try shot number 2. I thought I was holding over a little more the second time, but that shot actually struck below the first one. So I have one last shot to see if we have a tack driver. Yes! On the third shot, the Discoveryopt scope is a tack driver. I decided to come back to the shop for my final thoughts on the Discoveryopt EDAR scope because I've got a lot of things that I want to say. There are some things that I really like about this optic, and there are some things that I really don't like about this optic, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget something, or in the course of doing whatever I was doing out at the range, maybe gloss over something that I wanted to emphasize a little bit more. I'm going to start out with the things that I like about it. Beginning with, as I said before, this mount with the integral rings is really nice. That's a very high quality mount for a price that I think is extremely reasonable. If you need a 34 millimeter mount, if you need a 30 millimeter mount, I'm not sure if they make this in 1" or not, but you can check the website for Discoveryopt and find that out for yourself if you happen to need a 1" mount. I also like the fact that you get so many accessories with this scope, to include this little tool, which I think is kind of fun. And I did use this time. I remembered it when I went out to the range, so when I reset my turret caps to 0, I was able to use the proper tool to do that, rather than using a coin, which would be my other option. The magnification range on this scope from 1 to 8 power makes it very versatile. You can use it for everything from up close work all the way back to several hundreds of yards, and it's going to be just fine. I like the 1 to 8 power range because it gives you a lot of options as far as how you can use this scope and the rifle it's mounted to. The fact that it has parallax adjustment all the way down to 5 yards and up to infinity just enhances that versatility. And when I was all the way up doing the tack test at a distance of, I think I was at 10 yards actually when I shot the tack test. I normally do that at 7. This time it was a long range tack test, so I was shooting from 10 yards, and I was able to dial that in and get very sharp focus on the tack. So as you saw, that worked out pretty well. Something else impressive about the side focus parallax adjustment is how precise the settings are for the distances from which you might be shooting. When I was at 10 yards, I dialed this to 10 yards and I had clear, sharp focus on my target. When I was at 100 yards, same thing. When I was at 50 yards, working on my initial 0 of this optic, everything dialed right to the setting on the knob in order to get sharp focus on my target. So that's nice. That's not always the way it works out, but that was the way that it worked out this time around. The illumination for this scope is adequate for virtually any lighting condition you might find yourself in. Now you're only illuminating the horseshoe and the center dot, as I said earlier in the video. But when you dial this all the way down to 1 power and the reticle is so small and you're able to use that illumination, that's one time where I would use illumination in an optic like this. Also, when I was back at 100 yards and I was shooting at the target while I was on 1 power, and I used the horseshoe around the bullseye target with the illumination, that made it a little easier to see when the reticle was so small. So that worked out pretty well using it for that purpose. One of my favorite features of this scope, maybe my favorite feature of all, are the locking turret caps. I really like this, being able to lock those down wherever you set them so they don't get inadvertently moved, and particularly when I reset the 0 marking to the indicator on the scope body, being able to lock that down, take out the big screw, pull this off, turn it, line the 0 up with where it needs to be, put it back down, and tighten that big screw again without having to worry about changing the setting while I'm doing that. I really, really like these turret caps. As I said out at the range, I think this is the attachment method that every scope manufacturer should use.
The tracking on this scope when I conducted the box test, just like when I tested the last Discoveryopt scope, was outstanding. So these scopes mechanically inside are built very precisely, and that shows up when you're making those changes for elevation and windage, and also the fact that there's no point of impact shift while going through different magnification settings is another nice thing that shows the quality that goes into construction of these scopes and making sure everything moves just the way it's supposed to move. And the last thing I have under the like column is the price. It's hard not to like a scope of this type that comes in at less than $200, albeit just barely less than $200. Still, you're able to pick one up without breaking the bank. On we go to the other category, the dislike category. The first thing I'm going to mention in the dislike category before I get to the scope itself are the instructions, quote unquote, that come with the scope. As I said several times during the video, they're just not adequate to really familiarize a user with everything this scope does, how to make all the adjustments, etc. This needs to be revised and enhanced considerably so that it's a more usable document. Regarding the scope itself, the inability to focus the reticle with this eyepiece is something that really needs to be corrected. That could be a defect in this particular scope, and maybe no one else has one that has that issue. And maybe it's got something to do with the fact that it's such a wide magnification range. This goes from 1 all the way to 8 power, and the reticle needs to stay focused all the way through that magnification range. So I don't know if that's part of what's causing the issue or not. I had a problem like this years ago with another scope, but it was not nearly this bad. With this one, virtually any time I'm making very much of a magnification change, I'm having to stop and turn that thing and try to focus in the reticle. And as I said before, I can never get it just precisely in focus. It always seems like it's a little bit out of focus. And even when I'm aiming then, because of that fact, it will start to blur a little bit, which is somewhat disconcerting when you're trying to make a precise shot. That's something I definitely want to discuss with the folks from Discoveryopt. Something else that I mentioned out at the range is the fact that the glass in this scope, or maybe I should say the image that I see while looking through the lenses, is not as clear and bright as other scopes of this type that I've used before. Particularly in the higher magnifications, when I get up to 8 power, the image is noticeably darker and the colors are less distinct, etc., than when I'm in the lower magnification ranges. And that's one thing I think I was able to capture when I was trying to get some photographs through the scope. When you look at the 8 power image and the 1 power image, you can see that on 1 power, the image is much brighter and sharper, and on 8 power, it's darker and less distinct. The next thing I'll talk about is probably going to be kind of controversial because there's a lot of personal preference that goes into this characteristic, and a lot of it also has to do with the way you're intending to use this scope, and that is the reticle. I mentioned out at the range that one aspect in the reticle that I think is very confusing. I would strongly suggest that be deleted. And the reticle in general is very busy. Now, some people are really going to like that. They're going to want to use every aspect in there for some different thing that they're doing while they're shooting. Most shooters are probably only going to use that for quick elevation holds and windage holds. There's probably not going to be a lot of moving target leads or a lot of range estimation. Now, I think those are critical skills and those do need to be practiced from time to time. But to make this quicker to use and less confusing to the eye, I think that reticle should probably be simplified somewhat. Along with the comments I made regarding the glass and image clarity with this scope is the fact that when I dial it down to 1 power, there's a little bit of magnification that I can detect. It's not a true 1 power. It's not so bad that you can't use this or it's going to be a really major problem. But if you're someone who absolutely positively wants a true 1 power, you're not going to get it with this optic. As much as I like these windage and elevation turrets, There's something I don't like, and that's the fact that you get an occasional mushy click when you're dialing through your sight corrections. We saw that on the target actually when I was performing the box test. When I fired the first shot, it was pretty much right there in the middle of the 10 ring. It was a little off the X, but not bad. And when I made that very first correction for windage, I went one too many clicks to the right. And if you look at all the shots that I fired after that very first one, they're off to the right. And that's because as I was clicking my way through there, I had one time where I accidentally went 2 clicks, but it only felt like one because I had that mushy click in there. When I went down the first time, when I went down that 53 clicks or 5.3 mils, I had the same thing happen with the elevation turret, and we see the shots after that third one, the one that was in the lower left bullseye, that one was low, the one to the right of that was low, and my final shot, I apparently made up for it as I came back up and back to the center target. But those 2 shots were definitely low, and I'm sure that's because I got that one additional click of not elevation, but declination as I was going down that I didn't intend to put on there. And the last thing in the negative category is just the fact that this is a little chunky for an AR. At 24 plus ounces, so we're about 1.5 pounds. You add in the mount, we've got 2 pounds we're adding to the weight of the rifle. So for an AR, that's a little chunky. It's not bad, it's not horrible, it's not something that's going to be terrible to try to use in a match or out in the field or whatever, but it's just something that's noticeable. Part of that is because it's such a heavily constructed scope. It's got a 34 millimeter tube, so there are reasons why that weight is what it is, but it's just something else that I noticed and something I wanted to mention here at the end of the video. So there you go, folks. That's going to do it for my review of the Discoveryopt ED-AR 128x24 SFIR first focal plane LPVO, and it took me about 5 takes to get that all out without screwing it up. When I contact Discoveryopt about the issues that I've had with this scope, if they send me another one or they take this one back and repair it and it comes back to me and I'm able to take another look at it, I will try to update this video in the future. But for now, the things that I mentioned are all things that I saw while actually using this optic. In any case, that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, stop by hrfunk.com, check out all the product information there, and you might find some other information that'll save you a couple of bucks with your purchase in the future. See you next time, folks, and until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.